Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now, one of the questions I get asked regularly is how I prep my 3D printed parts for paint. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the entire process as I prep a piece for an upcoming project. So let's get to it. Because I tend to get a little impatient from time to time, I started assembling the print off camera. But thankfully, there's a whole second half that still needs to be glued up. I recently stumbled onto this solvent-based adhesive called Weldon 16 that works extremely well on PLA and PLA+, which is what I used for this build. All of the filament was provided by Duramic 3D, the sponsor of this week's video. I find that using a bit of gaffer's tape along the seams helps to get the parts aligned more quickly and keeps them from sliding around while the adhesive sets up. Clamps are also really helpful in making sure that everything is aligned correctly. Now that everything is bonded together, I'm going to add in a bit of an insurance policy by way of a wood burning tool. From the inside of the dome, I'll use this flat bit to melt the seams together. This will ensure a solid bond, but will also act as a dam for when I start applying body filler into any of the seams where the two parts come together. With all the seams melted together on the inside of the dome, I can start to address the small gaps on the outside with a bit of air dry spot putty. It's really important to push the putty into the gaps, otherwise you run the risk of the putty falling out in the future. It's also really crucial to give everything sufficient time to dry before applying any additional filler. Now that the spot putty has had time to dry, I can start sanding with an 80 grit sandpaper and my multi-tool. I'm using higher grit paper because there's some areas of the print that will need a bit more help to get them to a smooth surface, and it's typically better to start with a smooth surface than to try and add material to an uneven one and then flatten that out. I also had a few parts that didn't align properly, so I switched over to a palm sander with 80 grit paper and worked those areas until they were flush. When I felt that the majority of the dome was smooth, I mixed up a slurry of 3 parts spot putty and 1 part acetone. This is a loose recipe. The important part is that it's thin enough to be brushed onto the surface and can sink into the fine lines of the 3D print. I like to use this method for applying putty to any trouble areas since it helps to stretch the amount of putty I use, but also because the thin layers dry faster and are easier to sand. And speaking of sanding, once the putty has dried, I'll switch back to my multi-tool and do another round of sanding with 120 grit sandpaper. After I've made my way around the entire piece, I'll grab a marker or a pencil and we'll circle any areas that need a bit more attention. These high spots needed a lot of work, so I started with 80 grit, followed by 120 grit, and sanded until it was smooth. Now that the bulk of the sanding is done, I can move on to priming the piece. But first I'll use a tack cloth to remove any excess dust and dirt. As you can see, even after blasting this part with air, there was quite a bit of spot putty dust left behind that would prevent good primer adhesion, so it's important to really clean your parts before paint. Because my primer's been out in the cold shop, it needs to be warmed up a bit before I apply it, so I'll fill a bucket with some hot water and let the spray can hang out while I set up my Lazy Susan. After 10 minutes in the hot water bath and a full minute of shaking, I'm ready to start applying sandable filler primer. This first coat doesn't have to be too heavy, since thick coats will take a long time to dry, and any uncured primer will clog up your sandpaper. So take your time and build up your primer coat with sufficient dry time between each layer until the bulk of your remaining layer lines have disappeared. With the primer dry, I could tell there were still some areas that needed more work, so off camera I did a bit more aggressive sanding, and then it was time for some wet sanding with 220 grit paper. Wet sanding helps to keep all of the dust at bay, but also does a really good job at smoothing everything over and getting it ready for one last primer coat. If you were planning on making a silicone mold of this part, you could wet sand from 220 all the way up to 1200 for an ultra smooth finish. But that won't be necessary for this part. With the last coat of primer applied and wet sanded again to knock down any nibs in the finish, it's finally ready for paint. but that'll have to wait for next time.
Now there's still plenty to be done in this project, but this seems like a good place to stop. I'd like to thank this video's sponsor, Duramic 3D, for providing all of the filament, and I'll leave a link to their website if you'd like to check it out. That's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.